Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's Memo Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, hello, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Nasim, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
So this week, Mouin, we'll begin with developments in the West Bank. Smotrich declaring permanent control of the West Bank, Israel seeking to annex it completely, escalating settler violence and conditions of apartheid in the West Bank, which has been reported on by the New York Times. More revelations of sexual abuse in the Palestinians and Israel in Israel's Tamim detention center. We covered this last week, but there were more horrific revelations, and I wanted to focus on that as well. And then there's a number of stories actually related to Israel suffering major losses in its military aggression in Gaza. So we'll discuss that. And also a number of stories on Western censorship and the first ever Israel loyalty test introduced by a European country, in this case, namely Germany. Details of that. And then also, I want to get your thoughts on the US presidential race. There was a debate last week between Biden and Trump, implications of that for Israel Palestine. So we will get to that later, but let's begin with the West Bank, where Israel's far-right minister, Bezalel Smotrich, revealed a plan to impose permanent control over the occupied West Bank. Apparently, he's found a way to do this without the government being accused of annexing the West Bank. I want to focus on that, but keeping in mind that, this annexation of the West Bank has been something proposed by the Israelis for many, many years. And should we consider this as another case of Israel squeezing concession from the Arab countries? Because last time, Netanyahu, this is in 2020, I think, threatened to annex the West Bank. And when he did that, he was rewarded with the Abraham Accords, and also the UAE specifically justified its normalization, saying that its normalization prevented Israel's annexation of the West Bank.
Yeah. Thank you, Nasim. Well, maybe just to backtrack to the second part of your question, for those who may not recall, in 2020, the Trump administration, by way of its Middle East specialist, Prince Jared of Kushner, released an initiative called From Peace to Prosperity that basically gave Israel the right to unilaterally annex over 1/3 of the West Bank. And the Israeli government at the time, also led by Benjamin Netanyahu, announced plans to conduct such an annexation on July 1st. Then, for a variety of reasons, having to do both with the domestic Israeli political scene, US-Israeli relations, and fear of international ramifications, Israel essentially suspended its annexationist measures. And then that was used cosmetically, I should add, by the United Arab Emirates as a pretext for normalizing relations with Israel. What the United Arab Emirates claimed at the time was that in exchange for normalization, Israel was effectively suspending its annexationist measures, although it's quite clear that even without UAE normalization, Israel had already taken a decision that it would be an inopportune time to proceed with annexation. What we're seeing now is essentially Israel negotiating with itself, and one part of the Israeli government providing concessions to another part of the Israeli government. What do I mean by this? In retaliation for Palestinian diplomatic victories in the context of growing number of excuse me, European states, Belgium, Ireland, Spain, and most recently Slovenia, recognizing Palestinian statehood, and in retaliation for progress in international legal institutions, Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's far-right finance minister, announced that he would no longer transfer any Palestinian tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority. I won't get into the details, but basically, shortly after the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, pursuant to an Israeli-Palestinian economic agreement, Israel collects these Palestinian import duties and other taxes on the Palestinian Authority's behalf and is obligated to transfer them to the Palestinian Authority on a monthly basis. Of course, it has repeatedly used these as a form of political leverage. And in this case, Smotrich said, well, I can't retaliate against Spain. I can't retaliate against Ireland or Belgium or Slovenia. So I will retaliate against the weak link in the chain, as it were, and stop transferring these tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority. And under the current economic crisis, these tax receipts make up about 70% of the Palestinian Authority budget. It propelled the PA into severe economic crisis, which is not only a problem for the Palestinian Authority and its employees, but is just as much of a problem for Israel and the United States, because these salaries, of course, go to the security forces, the Palestinian security forces, whose main, arguably only function is to keep a lid on Palestinian resistance to Israel and to cooperate, to collaborate with the Israeli security forces to try to prevent attacks on Israeli soldiers and settlers in the West Bank. So the Israeli security establishment was up in arms, basically saying, we're trying to conduct a genocide in the Gaza Strip. You're now going to force us to have to relocate forces to the West Bank at a time when there may also be a war with Lebanon, because our basically subordinates, the Palestinian Authority security forces, can no longer function. So finally, they made a deal. Here's what the deal looks like. Smotrich, in his capacity as finance minister, will transfer the bulk, not all, but approximately 70%, I believe, of monies owed to the Palestinian Authority, which serves, again, primarily Israeli interests. And in exchange for this, Smotrich is being allowed to retroactively legitimize new settlements in the West Bank, expand other settlements. So it's basically, a win-win situation for Israel. And as you know, this is further deepening the annexation of the West Bank, because Smotrich, in addition to being finance minister, also has a status of a minister within the defense ministry that in effect makes him the viceroy of the West Bank. And he's been transferring certain key functions to his far-right and settler cronies in terms of the administration of these territories. And the broader point here is it demonstrates once again that this is, not about the Gaza Strip. We're certainly not only about the Gaza Strip or about Hamas or the rest of it. It is about Israel demanding exclusive control, total hegemony over the entirety of mandatory Palestine, the West Bank, which Israel officially refers to as Judea and Samaria. It considers Israeli territory. It considers the Palestinian residents of this territory, in effect, as illegal squatters, whose eviction is simply going to be a matter of time. And annexation has been on the agenda for decades. It's been called creeping annexation because of the manner in which Israel expanded its control over the West Bank. And now we've reached the stage of what some analysts have called leaping annexation, of basically formalizing the de facto realities that Israel has established in these territories since 1967.
So you spoke about the domestic forces that is animating this, but speak to the much wider issues. So, for example, As we know, the US has been totally ineffective in reining in Israel from committing genocide in Gaza. It's issued red lines after red lines, and the US policy, we must conclude, is simply that, we will condemn Israel, we will issue red lines, but once Israel does what it wants to do, we'll offer ironclad support. That's always been the policy throughout his genocidal campaign in Gaza. So is that really exploiting that weakness in the US, knowing also we'll get to Trump may be elected, but also what does that do in terms of the Abraham Accords? Saudi has condemned this, but if push comes to shove, do you think the Saudis, because one of the conditions Saudis have demanded is a pathway to a two-state solution. So of course, if this annexation goes ahead, two-state solution is dead. So does that mean the Abraham Accord and normalization with the Saudi is dead and everything's, the last 4 years of trying to normalize relationship is completely undermined?
Well, Saudi Arabia, of course, is not a party to these grandiosely entitled Abraham Accords. And Saudi Arabia has a very different domestic and regional set of calculations than did the United Arab Emirates. And Saudi-Israeli normalization was always going to be a rather different beast than was Emirati Israeli normalization. So in that sense, I don't think it affects the Saudi trajectory because that was never on for a number of reasons. This just gives one more reason for ensuring that it won't happen anytime soon. As far as the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco are concerned, particularly the Emirates, forestalling annexation was simply window dressing. It was purely cosmetic. It was never a significant motivation for the Emiratis in terms of their normalization of relations with Israel. It just allowed them to market it. And so therefore, I don't think this will have any effect on Israeli-Emirati relations. Certainly, the past year hasn't. In terms of the others, you look at Morocco, well, there have been widespread demonstrations in Morocco this week because the Moroccan authorities permitted a ship carrying weapons to Israel that had been refused docking rights in Spain to dock in Tangier. So therefore, in effect, placing Morocco in the position of providing direct support to Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip. In the broader scheme of things, as you mentioned, Israel has learned over the decades that it can safely ignore any protests or criticism or condemnations, condemnations, of course, being exceptionally rare, coming from Washington or Brussels, from its American or European sponsors, because these tend to be limited to verbal slap on the wrist. There are no consequences. And just as the Israelis have learned to ignore what the Americans and the Europeans say and to pay attention only to what the Americans and Europeans do, or in this case, don't do, I think we should take a similar approach. Words are meaningless. Words are intended to divert attention from inaction. And there's a final element here, which is that this summer, the International Court of Justice in The Hague is expected to deliver its ruling on the advisory opinion requested by the United Nations General Assembly on the legality of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. And anything that strengthens the case that Israeli rule is not or is no longer a military occupation, which is a recognized status under international law, but is in fact a form of intended permanent annexation, will strengthen the case that Israeli rule in these territories is illegitimate and illegal and therefore must end forthwith.
And ICJ, no doubt, is keeping a close eye on what's happening in the West Bank. And one of the well-known journalist in the New York Times has also come back from the West Bank, Nicholas Kristof, and published what I think is really a fantastic article exposing the ethnic cleansing that's taking place. Christoph is pretty well known, and he doesn't say it as ethnic cleansing. He said there are allegations Israel carrying out ethnic cleansing, but everything he describes indicates ethnic cleansing, burning Palestinian homes, Palestinian land, forcibly displacing them from their communities. And then he goes on to conclude by saying, and I quote, while the term apartheid is overused for Israel as a whole, it accurately describes the situation in the West Bank. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, and the fact that someone like Nicholas Christoph is now writing about the West Bank in the way we would hope, because as we know, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, there's a wall-to-wall consensus. Israel is committing the crime of apartheid in the West Bank, and usually mainstream media is quite slow to respond. And there seems to be, they nevertheless seem to be responding now.
Well, I think it's a significant sign of the times that you get prominent establishment liberals like Nicholas Kristof writing in American Pravda, no less, in the New York Times, writing these kinds of articles, which would have been exceptionally rare in previous years and would have come from very different authors. So on the one hand, you're beginning to increasingly get these establishment liberals writing about Israel and the Palestinians, recognizing the Palestinians, increasingly recognizing reality, while at the same time, Israel really has to scrape the bottom of the barrel, getting people like Dr. Phil McGraw to fly to Tel Aviv and interview Netanyahu. I mean, if you look at the types of, clowns and jokers who Israel has had to recruit to present its case, I think it's significant. 10, 20 years ago, it would have been people like Nicholas Kristof who would be leading the charge on behalf of Israel, rather than emerging as one of its more prominent critics.
That was Jordan Peterson. People like Jordan Peterson.
Exactly. As far as apartheid is concerned, yes, the word is overused, and rightly so. Just as it was overused when for many years it was impossible to utter the two words South Africa without preceding it with apartheid or appending apartheid to it. And the reason it's overused is because Israel is an apartheid state. It has practiced apartheid against a significant portion of its own citizens since the very moment the state was established in 1948. And since 1967, it has also practiced apartheid against the millions of Palestinians, non-citizen Palestinians, who live under its thumb. And as Amnesty International has argued, it also practices apartheid against those who it has sought to permanently exile from their homeland, namely that 50+% of Palestinians who are Palestinian refugees.
Now, I want to turn to a story we've covered before, as I mentioned earlier, but because of the sheer horror of what's happening and new revelations about rape and sexual abuse, I wanted to touch upon that once again, which is the news from Israel's detention center in the Negev settlement. So there was a lawyer, Khalid Mahajne. So he visited the detention center. It's been named the death camp. He calls it the death camp, and spoke about harrowing accounts of rape of Palestinian detainees. And he said the situation there is worse than anything we've seen, including Abu Ghraib, where American soldiers, as we recall, 2004, sexually abused Iraqi detainees. And it's also worse than Guantanamo Bay. So let's talk about that and contrasting the allegations of rape and sexual abuse with a new report in the Grey Zone, which has done amazing work in exposing some of the rape hoax and atrocity hoax from Israel. And in this case, the Grey Zone debunked a well-known story from, I think, 2 months ago that was being tweeted by many pro-Israeli organizations of a father and son confessing to rape. Now that story has been debunked because there are piles and piles of evidence, basically finding flaws in the story, saying it could never have happened.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to quote unquote confessions being made by individuals in Israeli custody, I think, these should be dismissed as a matter of principle. You have doctors who confess to being commanders in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and basically hiding long-range rockets in the abdominal cavities of their patients. Now you have a father and son confessing to jointly conducting rape. I mean, this is stuff that would make interrogators from North Korea blush. And the reason it continues is because it's soaked up by Western mainstream media, regurgitated and presented as genuinely credible. The real scandal here, I think, is less these frauds and falsehoods being put out by Israel of prisoners who they have tortured into saying anything they want them to say. I think the real scandal here is that these stories are still being given currency by Western mainstream media until disproven. The scandal is that they even need to be disproven, and that all these hoaxes and frauds and false confessions later, the necessary skepticism, I would argue, the necessary categorical dismissal still has not entered the mentality of many of these journalists and editors regarding the issue you mentioned. This is based on a story in the Israeli electronic magazine Plus 972. And I unfortunately forget the name of the reporter, but it's based on an extensive interview with a lawyer, Khalid al-Mahajni, who is an Israeli citizen and therefore has, let's say, more access than would his counterparts from the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. And this is no amateur. This is someone who has specialized in visiting prisons and defending security prisoners for the better part of 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, has had access to virtually every prison in the Israeli gulag, and recounts what he saw in this detention facility, which specializes in housing detainees who have been captured from the Gaza Strip since last October. And what he describes, I mean, if you presented this as a script for a movie, it would probably be dismissed as being too unrealistic. It's that horrific. You have just some of the details. People being blindfolded 24/7, dozens of people to a cell, not permitted to speak to each other. We've been over these issues before, and it just keeps getting worse. Several dozen already dead under torture. Kind of reminds you of French Algeria during the late 1950s. One roll of toilet paper for 100 prisoners per day, being fed food that a dog would refuse, and in amounts that help explain these images we're seeing, where those who emerge from this prison look at least twice the age they were the day they were arrested. And of course, all the focus is not on what's being done to Palestinians, but on all these fraudulent stories about what Palestinians have supposedly done.
And that father and son rape story in particular, that was, for me, it was another case of Western pro-Israeli advocates scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the Grey Zone has done an amazing job in debunking this as well, exposing the leaks and the holes. And I mean, there's too many evidence for me to list, but just to read out a couple. They found that the alleged rape took place in a kibbutz known as Nir Oz on 7 October. So there is no victim with that name. The rape and murder of a woman in her 30s that was described doesn't align with any known victim. The three women in that age range were either killed in different circumstances and are still alive. And the timeline is impossible. There is no way the father and son, as alleged, carried out the rape because of the timeline being completely at odds. So that's just two of 7 or 8 different examples they cite evidence to disprove that claim. So I urge the readers to go and read the Grey Zone piece.
Yes, and if I can just add to that, without taking anything away from such type of investigative journalism, which is necessary, for me, it's simply enough to know that a prisoner in Israeli custody has made a particularly lurid confession to automatically assume that it's false. I didn't need to wait for this investigation. And again, without taking anything away from this investigation, the real scandal is that it was even necessary and that journalists and editors in Western mainstream media were prepared to consider this as a serious story unless debunked, that they had to wait for it to be debunked.
Let's turn our attention to a number of examples where we are seeing stiff resistance against Israeli occupation forces in Gaza. So there was a report this week that over 500 Israeli vehicles and tanks have been destroyed since October. I want to contrast that with the first Gulf War in 1999, which is actually known as the Tank War, where Iraqi army only managed to destroy some 50 coalition tanks, US tanks mainly. So contrast 50 with 500 in Gaza. It seems like Israel's really struggling to gain any control in its genocide campaign in Gaza.
Well, I would like to point out, those were rather different armed conflicts on rather different battlefields of different durations. But having said that, again, this demonstrates that Israel basically has two options, neither of which are to its credit. One is to cut its losses and accept an end to its genocidal onslaught. And the other is to sink ever deeper into the quicksand of the Gaza Strip. I mean, 9 months into this Israeli attempt to eradicate its adversary, and it's now had to deploy to the Shujaiya quarter of Gaza City. I believe it's the second or third time, where the Israeli military already suffered a significant defeat in 2014, suffered another significant defeat earlier this year, and now appears to be going nowhere with its further attempt to eliminate the Palestinian militants who appear to be in full control of their fighting abilities. When you hear the Israelis who have yet to establish any kind of meaningful control over Rafah, basically announcing a victory that will be coming in the next week. I mean, it's almost like predicting that you've won the final during the first round. And this is, self-glorification is admittedly a very deeply ingrained Israeli habit, particularly of its military. But, one doesn't need to be a strategic genius or military expert to understand that Israel is experiencing perhaps not defeat, but certainly strategic failure in the Gaza Strip. Its only success really is in the mass murder of civilians and particularly children these past 9 months.
And what you say, the strategic failure, is borne out by our next story, which is the Israeli Supreme Court last week ruling to end the military exemption for ultra-Orthodox Jews. And so this is the first time in the history of Israel when ultra-Orthodox Jews will now be required to fight in the Israeli military. So that shows there is a sense that it is in a state of emergency. It needs more soldiers. It needs every member of the country to fight and defend the country. So how significant is this in your view, keeping in mind also reports from last week that the Israeli army is being affected seriously by suicide, low morale, and also there's a rise in mental illness, and also dozens of Israeli reserve soldiers refusing to return to Gaza. So there's an image that's coming out that Israel is struggling in Gaza, but also its soldiers are demoralized, and at the same time, the court has intervened to force the Orthodox Jewish community to fight and join the military campaign.
Well, I think it's a significant development in several respects. People often mistake the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community for these kinds of, nationalist religious fanatics of the settler movement, and kind of the more traditional Orthodox Jewish communities have traditionally had a rather agnostic, if you will, attitude towards Zionism and the state of Israel. They're not motivated by nationalism, and already before the state was formed or shortly thereafter, kind of a deal was cut between the leaders of this community and the leaders of the new state, whereby they would the ultra-Orthodox youth of conscription age would not be conscripted, and their permission to continue with their religious studies would be viewed as their contribution to the state. And that's an arrangement that has lasted for decades. But what you began to see over the decades is a growing number of agnostic or atheist Israeli Jews all of a sudden, fanatically pursuing Torah studies to avoid being conscripted. And, this has to do with changes in Israeli society and so on. But the problem Israel is encountering now, it's not Egypt, it's not the United States, it's not Russia. And the prospect of a two-front, potentially three-front war with the severe burdens placed on the Israeli military, and as you mentioned, the morale of its soldiers and so on. This almost year-long war of attrition has created a real need for it to get all the manpower that is available. And that's one context. The other is the growing disaffection and dissatisfaction among Israeli Jews who are conscripted, who are called upon to perform reserve duty above and beyond what they would normally do. Their disaffection and dissatisfaction that there's this other sector of Israeli society that is basically being left to its own devices. It also speaks to the growing polarization, I think, of Israeli society. And it's in that context that we saw this recent ruling by the Israeli Supreme Court that the state is under an obligation to draft these ultra-Orthodox youth. Now, on the one hand, that is going to significantly expand the polarization within Israeli society on multiple levels. On the other, many of these ultra-Orthodox youth will need some kind, let's call it a supplementary education, before they can be properly conscripted and trained in the military, because they come from a background where, let's say, from a different educational system, where their focus has been very much on religious studies and so on, rather than on many of the topics and subjects that would help prepare them, to deal with maintenance of a tank, or figuring out how to shoot artillery and so on. So yeah, it's both representative of a symptom of what is becoming an increasingly serious problem for the Israeli military. And the decision itself, I think, will also create new problems within Israeli politics and society. Also because these ultra-Orthodox religious parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, and I think there may be one other one, are central to the survival of the current government. And these are parties that generally, will go with any coalition, provided they get the support from the state. So they're not wedded to Netanyahu's ideological project, the way that Smotrich and Ben Gvir are. And if they don't get the goods they were promised, they may let the coalition collapse and look for alternatives.
And another key story well, let's move out from Gaza. And the key story from the region is the US apparently preparing to evacuate Americans from Lebanon. So this seems to be an admission that there is a war, and Israel is already at war with Hezbollah. And the question is not whether there will be a regional war, but rather at what intensity. And it seems to be at the moment there is a war. It's at a low intensity, but it's likely going to escalate. So how should we read into that, given the US has now prepared, or is said to be preparing to evacuate Americans from Lebanon?
Well, in fact, a number of states, both within the region and from further abroad, have already begun issuing travel advisories and calling upon their citizens who are in Lebanon to get out while commercial flights are still available. And what has happened now is that the United States has sent a warship to the Eastern Mediterranean, which, according to a number of analysts, is there not to participate in any military activities, but to assist in the evacuation of US citizens from Lebanon, should it come to a general conflagration. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. The first is either that the Americans have concluded that Israel intends to go to war against Lebanon and have decided to do nothing about it. The second is that the Americans and the Israelis have jointly planned for a war against Lebanon to try to eliminate Hezbollah. And the third is that the real purpose here is to seek to intimidate Hezbollah into acceding to Israeli demands regarding to the border zone, so that there is what the Americans and the Israelis refer to as a diplomatic rather than military solution. Of course, their problem is that Hezbollah is not going to be deterred. Hezbollah is not going to accept any limitations on its activities within sovereign Lebanese territory, unless this is done in agreement and cooperation with the Lebanese state and the Lebanese military. It's not going to allow either the Israelis or the Americans to dictate matters within Lebanon. And the problem for the Americans is they have been consistently keen to avoid a full-scale regional war, even while adopting policies that make it increasingly likely. And they particularly want to avoid a scenario in which Israel attacks Lebanon, a full-scale conflict erupts between Hezbollah and Israel and other regional parties. Most specifically, Iran is drawn into it. They don't want to be in a position of having to more actively rush to Israel's defense than they already have, particularly in the context of a US election cycle.
Talking about rushing to Israel's defense and US consistency, Americans are also circling the wagons domestically to make sure Israel is given free rein in doing whatever he wants to do. And we saw two examples of that. Example which I never imagined I would see. First, last week, US lawmakers voted to prevent the government from citing numbers from the Palestinian, numbers of Palestinian death from the Gaza Health Ministry, basically saying no government agency should quote the Gaza Health Ministry, and and that and Germany imposing what to me and everyone I speak to looks like an Israel loyalty test for new citizens or new people, new migrants who want to be part of or become German citizens. It's quite an incredible move in both cases, in Washington and also in Germany, demanding Israel loyalty. Of course, American states, number of American states have laws in the statute books which require, you can say, an Israeli loyalty test to acquire contracts. But now Germany seems to be having or introducing something similar to that as well.
Yes, and all the while preaching freedom of opinion and freedom of conscience and freedom of this and freedom of that. I mean, who takes these people seriously anymore? What's next? New immigrants are going to have to contribute money to buy artillery shells so that Israel can continue with its genocide. Um, German officials have for decades claimed that the lesson they learned from the genocides that they have committed, most recently and notoriously, of course, the Holocaust, that the lesson they learned from that was never again. Well, increasingly, it looks like the real lesson they learned is let's do it again. And this idea that one has to pledge loyalty to a genocidal apartheid state in order to qualify for German citizenship is it's Orwellian, it's Kafkaesque, and it's whatever other adjectives you care to attach to that. And in the U.S., yes, the U.S. Congress specializes in hiding the sun with its finger, but that's not going to prevent it from getting very crisply sunburnt at the end of the day. And the again. The issue here, I think, is that when you see Israel and its apologists and its flunkies and its sponsors increasingly resorting to coercive legal measures to enforce its narrative and enforce loyalty to its policies and so on. Yes, this is painful. Yes, this is going to make people suffer. But it also shows that they're losing, that they've lost the plot. 10, 20, 30 years ago, none of this would have been necessary. Now, this is the only way that they can keep a lid on things. And that, to me, is significant.
And on that topic, we've seen something similar in the UK as well, an intervention by the UK government at the ICC. And the UK government at the ICC is expected to delay a decision over whether an arrest warrant can be issued against Benjamin Netanyahu. What do you know about this specific intervention by the Brits?
Well, the International Criminal Court in 2021 settled the matter of jurisdiction, in which it stated that Palestine, for the purposes of the Rome Statute, is a member of the International Criminal Court, that the territory of the state of Palestine encompasses the entirety of the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, and that the court therefore has jurisdiction over, on the one hand, any crime committed on the territory of the state of Palestine and any crime committed anywhere by a Palestinian who is a national of the state of Palestine. It did leave one or two issues unresolved, which is that whether the state of Palestine can let's say, transfer jurisdiction over such crimes to the International Criminal Court, or whether it in fact is not authorized to do so, not because of its status as a state, but because of details because of arrangements made between Israel and the PLO in the context of the Oslo agreements. I mean, the Oslo agreements contained some genuinely flabbergasting articles, such as that if any Palestinian were to sue, first of all, if a Palestinian who, let's say, was wronged in any way during the period before Oslo, before 1993, seeks to sue the state of Israel or any of its agents for that wrongdoing, first of all, the Palestinian Authority is obligated to do everything in its power to stop that Palestinian from doing so. Should that Palestinian nevertheless succeed in bringing their case before an Israeli court of law, and in the event that an Israeli court of law were to award compensation to that Palestinian, that compensation subsequently has to be paid to the state of Israel by the Palestinian Authority. Imagine. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent of, when slavery was abolished, it wasn't the slaves who were compensated, but the former slaveholder who were compensated for their financial loss. And so I digressed, but the point is that I believe the UK government is now challenging the jurisdiction of the ICC over this case by seeking to mobilize the Oslo Accords. One never hears about the UK challenging the jurisdiction of the ICC over Russian crimes in Ukraine, given that neither Russia nor the Ukraine are parties to the ICC, but that's just by the by. When it comes to Israel, impunity is a central tenet of Western policy. The interesting thing here is that it's widely expected that the Tories are about to get evicted from government and will be replaced by what is known as a Labour Party still, and whether they're the person who is expected to be Britain's next prime minister, Keir Starmer, will continue to challenge ICC jurisdiction. I'd be very surprised if he reverses course.
And Starmer is, of course, a human rights lawyer. So you'd assume that he would be on the side of the
let's
ICC.
not exaggerate.
You'd assume he'd be on the side of the ICC. But Starmer, the Labour Party, as many say, the Toryfication of the Labour Party is the reason why it's going to win the election. That's the main reason. Yeah.
Yes, I mean there's the Toryfication of the Labour Party. That's certainly a case. But Starmer is a human rights lawyer who, like so many in positions of power, when they have to choose between what they claim to be their principles and loyalty to Israel, the principles go out the window and Israel gets an even stronger embrace. So
I mean, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it is interesting in the case of Starmer as a human rights lawyer. He was at one time, he could be seen in pro-Palestinian events with PSC, Palestine group in the UK. Now, these groups are now seen as anti-Semites, but he would be in those events. And also he's known for defending so-called Islamists and terrorists. So in his case, it's quite a massive shift from where he was prior to becoming a Labour MP to now being, some would say, more to the right of Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister. So the Toryfication of Labour is, I think, absolute. And that explains, to me anyway, why he's now seen as a safe hand for the establishment to become Prime Minister of the UK.
And just to judge how safe his hands are, let's see whether he continues with this British effort to convince the ICC that it doesn't have jurisdiction. Well, although it may be the case that the UK government has to present its case before the election, I'm not sure. But should that not be the case, I fully expect Starmer to continue full steam ahead with the Toryfication of Labour foreign policy, as it were.
Yeah. Let's end with the big debate from last week, Trump and Biden.
You call that a debate?
Well, yeah, I mean, the consensus is that it was whitewash, basically terrible performance by Biden. And there's calls within the Democrats and key supporters of Democrats. I think there was 4 articles in the New York Times calling for Biden to drop out of the race. That's how bad his performance was. But I don't want to dwell on that specifically. I think what's concerning is there is now a narrative that Trump is likely going to win. And bearing in mind that Trump has been such a pair of safe hands for the Israelis, last time he won the election, Sheldon Adelson, billionaire tycoon, is now passed away. He donated several millions to him on the pledge that Trump would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the embassy. This time, which he did, and this time his wife has reportedly pledged 100 million. So what do you think she's buying with this 100 million? Going back to our first question, which is annexation of the West Bank. And, so the election generally, the debate, sorry, and also what do you think she's buying with that? If Trump, as many fear, is going to become the next president of the US. Of course, there's a long way to go, but let's just assume that's the case.
Well, let's just start by noting that Adelson's widow, Miriam, is in fact an Israeli, Israeli born and bred, if I'm not mistaken. And what is she buying with that money? Well, I think last time around it was made more or less explicit that this is what Sheldon Adelson expected in return for his largesse to Trump. And he got it. There were, of course, other forces within the administration and its entourage pushing for similar policies. In this case, we're seeing Adelson, the widow, pledge, I believe you said $100 million, on the understanding, that Trump would be even more indulgent of Israel than Biden has been. Which is a very tall order, but she seems to think it's possible. But we haven't really heard of any specific demands that are being made. I would suspect it relates to annexation. Once again, it probably relates to the U.S. Bringing its full arsenal of pressures to bear on Saudi Arabia, to seek to forge a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement. It may have to do with Iran, increased weapons deliveries, and so on. But having said that, Trump is a thoroughly untrustworthy, duplicitous, not only a felon and crook, but also a fraudster. And so he will, last time it was pretty clear that he judged that fulfilling Adelson's wish list was in his best interest. He would have been just as capable of taking the money, and pursuing opposite policies. So the problem with Trump, from the perspective of your question, is that on the one hand, yes, he pursued fanatically pro-Israeli policies, but unlike Biden, he did them out of opportunism rather than conviction. And should Trump serve a second term after the November elections, it's at this stage, I think, difficult to say how he will conduct himself once in power.
I think that's an important point because Trump, the Trump base is not what it was 4 years ago. They have fractured. There's divisions. America First actually means America First for many within his base, and they don't want continuous US support for Israel. They want to stop the aid that goes to Israel, and for them, many of the Israeli donors have exposed themselves, especially AIPAC. It ran what was considered the most expensive elections in against Bowman in New York, primary elections against Bowman. Yes, so it's not the same base as it was.
No, if I can just interrupt you, it's not the same base. I think it is on the whole a very pro-Israeli base, but there are crucial sectors within that base who whose support for Israel perhaps stops when it comes to direct American participation in another Middle East war. Trump's pretentious or Trump's claim that he was an anti-war candidate, I think, contributed to his victory in 2007 against Hillary, who was all in for Iraq and all the rest of it. And I think this year, Trump can play that same card, particularly because Biden and Blinken and that group have supported every war in the Middle East they could lay their eyes on or their votes on in recent decades. So it'll be interesting to see if, given the very real threat of further regional escalation, and the plausible threat of direct American engagement, not only in the Red Sea, but perhaps even directly with Iran, whether that will be a red line either for Trump or for key constituencies of his.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin.
Thank you, Nasim.
And thank you all for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.